that he's going to do.
Well, and I think that the dangerous, edges here are that he's trying to undermine the media, trying to make up his own facts, and it could be that while unemployment and the economy worsens, he could have undermined the messaging so much that he can actually control exactly what people think, and that is our job.
Yeah,
that is our job. That is our job. That is our job.
That is your job.
Welcome to the Independent Review, a weekly podcast where we bring you the latest from the world of independent journalism. Whether you're a news junkie, a curious learner, or just looking for a fresh perspective away from the corporate media, this is the show for you. So join us now as we dive into the world of independent journalism on the Independent Review.
Welcome to the Independent Review. Today we will look at clips from Ryan Cristian, James Corbett, Whitney Webb, Richard Grove, and Johnny Vedmore. Now, let's jump to these clips from Ryan Cristian.
Read what I was going to say otherwise of information that continues to connect a lot of these dots, but they make a couple different points that I think I want to go over that I slightly disagree on. But it says the Patriot Front is making its rounds all over Twitter. This was posted on the 14th of this month, and everyone thinks they're feds. Now, he says, I can promise you that's the service level take. They enjoy being called feds because it hides their true origins. This goes much deeper with ties to the Azov and Ukraine. Well, here's what's interesting. It doesn't have to be one or the other, and that's usually how this seems to go, right? That just because we're saying that, like, for instance, if this is what I'm talking about, which it is clearly the Azov movement, which was the CIA-grown concept that has then spread, that's sort of like the idea of the moderate rebels concept. Now, whether or not the Saudi Wahhabism was seeded in the Middle East and grown using as a CIA operation, and whether or not that eventually got out of their control and these groups just existed and they're no longer under the thumb of the, that's something that's easy to see. I think even Saudi Arabia sort of admitted or alluded to that being the case. It still doesn't change the fact that it was still a government operation, right? That doesn't mean every single person in every terrorist group is all Fed, but it means that it's very clearly it was created that way. And then in most cases, you have people at the top who are still leading these in the directions of their choosing, where the people underneath them all believe that they're doing it for some religious reason. I mean, Saudi Arabia has even spoken on the fact that most of these people, and people have done research on this, in these terrorist groups, I'm talking Middle East at this point, aren't even necessarily religious. And that really does completely explode the narrative they want you to think, right? Because it's not really about what they're telling you. Now, in this case, he's arguing that right now the take on a lot of, I think Joe Rogan's the one that made this go very, despite, again, as usual, despite us harping on the Patriot Front and the obvious connections, Joe Rogan does a quick thing and talks about how they're obviously, and then that goes everywhere, right? That's how that works today. Now, obviously, he's gigantic, but it's interesting, the controlled flow of information. But at the end of the day, the narrative is now that they're all feds, and we can prove that. You can tell they're all just a bunch of feds, which is we should ask that question. I'm simply saying that I think that they're being led or created by that, but you can prove that there's an obvious agenda here that maybe is out of control. That's for you to decide. But he says, as you all know in the past articles that he's written, and you guys can look into that for yourself, I'm not sure exactly what he's referring to understand these groups, we have to find patterns of behavior, or what I taught in school, modus operandi, your MO, is the idea that the way you typically act. We begin with the Rise Above movement. The group was originally called the Do-It-Yourself DIY Division, but changed its name in 2017. We actually talked about that a while ago. The group is based out of Orange County and San Diego, and their founder is Robert Runda. We've talked about all these people. To summarize their ideology, they are neo-Nazis that have a fight club. They train to engage in fights, and I mean that's a crazy reduction of what it really is, to be quite honest. It's much, much, much bigger than that, but that's one part of it that does exist. They train to engage in fights, hand-to-hand combat, etc. They believe in physically beating down their enemies. Now, again, remember the Rise Above movement, which you'll get into here, is the international arm of the Azov movement. That's verifiable on FBI documents, on even Newsweek has covered that. Now, it says, this screenshot below is from the FBI criminal court. Oh, actually, here, I'll grab this one too. I always include this. The one I've shared many times from the old account. where in this should give you the links and everything else to the documents. And this one's the FBI admitting that they're neo-Nazis long before they tried to, hide that. And here's the Newsweek article talking about, to the expert on the group, telling you that they've gone international, showing you right there, Rise Above movement. It's in Italy, it's in Germany. Now, this is the screenshot. I believe this is from the similar, I think that's even the exact same one. Oh, no, it's not point 10, but it's the same document we're talking about. And he's simply showing you the Rise Above movement represents itself publicly through videos and other public postings, is combat ready. And it says right there, where was it? Yeah, right there, the Rundo, the guy we're talking about. That's what the point they're making. And he says, from FBI criminal court documents from Special Agent Scott Beerworth, who was investigating the group in 2017, 2018. The group that they were all worried about up until the moment this began. And we see a lot of us just kind of exploded the idea this was directly tied to the CIA. And then they all started going, no, you're all misunderstanding it. They're not Nazis at all. It's like, then why were you investigating it? Why was everybody saying that right up until on a dime, they started saying something else? It's just so sad how this works today. But it says, after digging further into Rundo, we found an alarming amount of ties between him and Ukraine, and specifically the Azov Battalion, or it's the Azov movement now, right? That's their own statements, because it's become a movement, and it's much, much larger than the National Guard, than the political group, than even the enforcement on the police on the street. It's everywhere. They have immersed themselves in the entirety of this government, and I've made that very clear. And that's a reason why they're so desperate not to make you, not for us not to see that, because you can prove that ties directly back to the CIA and Operation Aerodynamic. And we've talked about that many times as well. Now it says Rundo at one point was living in many European countries like Serbia, Bosnia, and took many trips to Germany, Ukraine, and Italy. Isn't it interesting? The three places where even Newsweek and the experts are telling you that they have expanded and their groups are present there. Now, even if you don't think there's a CIA tie, even though you can literally prove that using these documents, and I'll open that as well, actually, just so you have that. I think this is an important one to save. Read it for yourself. I mean, this is directly from CIA.gov, and it openly talks about building a fascist entity using, by the way, the Ukrainian Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists and all the things that you can represent right now in Ukraine. But he's saying that below is a picture of Rundo fighting a member of the Azov Battalion in Kiev. Right here. He's in the blue. Now it says, who was Rundo meeting specifically in Ukraine? Well, we've talked about this. Olenia Semenkia. That's actually what Newsweek also talks about in regard to her being, where was it? I thought it was right there. Wrong one, maybe? Oh, it's this one here. So I know the Azov Battalion is a paramilitary unit of the Ukrainian National Guard, which is known for its ideology of Nazi ideology. Saying, the Rise Above movement members during their trip to Germany, Ukraine, and Italy met with Olenia Semenkia, the leader of the International Department for the National Corps, which is a political party in the Ukraine that was founded in 2016 out of the regiment of the Ukrainian military called the Azov Battalion. This is FBI information. So she has been described as the first lady of Ukrainian nationalism. Isn't it funny, by the way, that all these Democrats are screaming to support Ukraine and fight for Ukraine, and yet anybody who even half mentions nationalism in any context is a dangerous person in this country? Her pseudo-intellectualism and international networking with neo-fascist groups, as well as her guru-like command of the Azov movement in Ukraine, made her a formidable power behind the throne of the Kiev regime. That's a direct quote from what the article he's pointing at. What business was discussed, he asked? Well, Rise Above movement was hosted by Olenia Semenkia, head of the National Corps, as we just pointed out. And it says, with a neo-Nazi and white supremacist affiliations. And this is undebatable. It's not debatable. This is the U.S. government documentation pointing this out. Semenkia later stated that Rundo and his compatriots, came to learn our ways and showed interest in learning how to create youth forces in the ways the Azov has. Now, this is showing the CIA agenda bleeding over into groups that then were used in the United States. And this is the point, that they infiltrated this, they created this. During her visit, the Rise Above I can't stop doing that. During her visit, the Rise Above movement members joined the Azov Battalion for sparring in this club, in the mixed martial arts club affiliated with the group. Rundo entered the MMA competition for white supremacists from across Europe, supposedly the first American to take part in the history of the event. While in Kiev, Rundo also got a tattoo of the Viking warrior logo, the White Rex, and the clothing label founded by Russian MMA fighter and Azov Battalion associate Denis Nikitin. It says Olenia has a knack for radicalizing Westerners, as can be described from the FBI court records. Okay, so they know that's happening. And yet, the moment the narrative shifts after February, they suddenly start saying that we should all be over there and joining them and fighting them. But the FBI is on the record saying this is, how does that even possibly make sense? Now, either they changed their mind and nobody's talking about that, which is silly, or there was a reason they wanted you to think this was dangerous until suddenly they changed their mind and didn't want you to think it was dangerous anymore. Why would that be? Likely because things got exposed they didn't want you to see. It says she was dead set on these men learning their ways. It says, with all the recent events that have gone down between Russia and Ukraine, we are all fully aware the United States government has no problem sending money and training to the military forces that reside there, and that certainly include the Azov movement, despite that being stated and illegal. Again, that's also in this discussion, but realize this one is from 2016. Congress has removed a ban on funding neo-Nazis. Now, at that time, they lied about this and said we banned it, and then they quietly removed it. As it says, under pressure from the Pentagon, Congress has stripped the spending bill of an amendment that prevented funds from falling in their hands. They knew it. They knew it. On the record, they were saying these are dangerous fascist groups. They openly said, we're going to stop this or we're going to ban it. And then quietly, the Pentagon said, sorry, we can't do that. You got to take that down. Why would that happen? Because we see they're building what they're doing. This is a building agenda. Then in 2018, they banned it again. But guess what? They kept funding them anyway. Now, right in this current moment, you can literally read in standing documentation, legislation, that it says you're not allowed to arm this group. That's either directly or indirectly. But they're doing that. End of story. Period. You want to explain how that's not illegal? They don't care, is the point. They just don't care. They don't think you're smart to connect the dots. You are. Now it says the same groups that our United States government has deemed enemy number one, white supremacists, is the same government that is inadvertently paying for their training. Now here's the point. It's not inadvertently, guys. This is what we need to understand. Now this is where I think I might be going to reach out to this person and maybe we can do an interview because I think it seems to be on the right track. And who knows, maybe I'm wrong and maybe he'll enlighten me. The point is that this is not up for debate, in my opinion, that this is not inadvertent. This is a classic agenda. It happened with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union. This was also directed at the Soviet Union at this time in the Ukraine. Support for Ukrainian the group and the, where was it here? Mykola Lebed, where you can look up for yourself, is a known Nazi war criminal who the CIA worked with, rescued from Poland, who was about to be put to death, and then set him up in a company called Prologue in New York City. It's a media company. You have a Nazi spreading media information to people under the guise that it's a New York U.S. company, and he was also operating out of the Ukraine. And that has grown since then, using all the same things we're talking about. I don't have this highlighted, but I went through this in depth before. And it's very clear to see what's actually going on. But not inadvertently, right? So they're lying to you going, white supremacist. Now, I'm going to point out a tweet. I'll show it and then I'll come back to it about people like this. Mehdi Hassan saying, it's very simple. If you're not a white supremacist, you shouldn't get really annoyed or upset when the president condemns white supremacists, right? Classically binary thinking, right? It's either good or bad because you don't have a job in corporate media if you're not willfully stupid like that. The bottom line is, we get mad, or let's say I get mad, because he's not talking about only white supremacists. He's talking about whatever they sweep up in their broad, ridiculous discussion and narrative and definition of what that means. And that's exactly what we're talking about in this discussion here, right? Well, enemy number one is white supremacists, yet they're currently funding open Nazis, neo-Nazis, and fascists, who are then openly stating about how they want to spread the white race around the world. What else would you call that? See, but they're not calling them white supremacists. They're calling them something else. So right there, you can see that this person is stupid, that you're not willing to look at the full picture, because when he says white supremacist, he's talking about a lot of people that are nothing of the kind. So when you make it simple and binary and say you either are with us or against us, you can go stand next to George Bush along with the other ridiculous people, right? That's how that works. But it says that the same government that he says inadvertently paid for their training, when they got back from Europe, the training was used to carry out the violence seen in Charlottesville. This is not easy to miss, or this is easy to see, right? So they trained them, and then literally that group and their international arm even carrying tiki torches that looked exactly like the ones they were carrying with the Azov movement in Ukraine. He says, more irony in the quote below, quote, it is important to note that the Rise Above movement was heavily trained by the U.S. government for their skirmishes with mostly white Antifa in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Berkeley, California. So it's on the record. They're going, the government trained these people. Similarly, disgraced alt-right leader Richard Spencer has not shied away from openly supporting neo-Nazi groups while promoting President Biden's policies regarding the conflict in Ukraine. How do you make sense of that? Usually it's kind of a one-stop shop for these people, which I think that's this person seems to serve as. He'll come up and be like, I support Trump. And everyone's like, see, he's a Nazi because Spencer agrees with him, or whatever the way they make that dumb connection. But it's funny how on one side they're going to say, see, Spencer's promoting this group, but then at the same time supporting Biden and Ukraine, but we don't care about that one. Okay, well, if it's basically this ubiquitous point that if Spencer supports it, then we should point at it and say it's bad. It's weird that you don't point at Ukraine because he's supporting that too, but you know why that's happening. These talking points were weaponized by Joe Biden's election speeches, and the irony is that under an Obama-Biden admin carried out a coup in Ukraine in 2014, which they made a regime change, which you know about. We've talked about this. And since we're here, let's play some of these clips. Here is a Ukrainian general telling you how this went down.
Для тех, кто смотрит, будет смотреть эту информацию. Господин Турчинов, господин Яценюк, господин Чернобог и же с ними. Я это заявляю открыто и достоверно знаю, что это проплаченные агенты Центрального разведуправления США. Ведь мало кто знает, что основной беспредел творил господин Ахметов Ринат Леонидович, господин Коломойский, глава Всемирного еврейского конгресса, господин Фирташ и же с ними. Все вот эти олигархи. А теперь это просто прямая оккупация Соединенными Штатами Украины через подставных лиц.
And here is the McCain and Graham in the location. Well, actually, let's play this one first, since this is obviously about the election, or specifically the Maidan Square lie, and the fact that this was a U.S. government operation. But don't miss that he mentions Kolomoisky, who, right, don't forget, is the chief finance backer behind the Azov movement. Oh, and interestingly enough, he also completely funded Zelensky's campaign. But don't look at the facts, because they don't want you to see any of this stuff.
On February 20th of 2013, the world was shocked by video footage of snipers firing on protesters in Kiev, Ukraine. 21 people were murdered, and it was widely assumed that President Viktor Yanukovych and his supporters were behind the attacks. However, a phone conversation between EU Foreign Policy Chief Cathy Ashton and Estonia's Foreign Minister Urmas Paet, which was leaked to the public on March 5th, reveals that the snipers were actually from the new coalition government, and that Western diplomats knew this and covered it up.
Yeah, so that he has some sort of, how to say, trust among all these Maidan people and civil society. And second, what was quite disturbing, the same Olga told that, well, all the evidence shows that people who were killed by snipers from both sides, among policemen and people from the streets, that they were the same snipers killing people from both sides.
Well, that's, yeah.
So that, and then she also showed me some photos. She said that has medical doctor. She can, say that it is the same handwriting, the same type of bullets, and it's really disturbing that now the new coalition, that they don't want to investigate what exactly happened. So that there is now stronger and stronger understanding that behind snipers, it was not Yanukovych, but it was somebody from the new coalition.
For some reason,
and you've heard that many times, and I love how Cathy Ashton's like, yeah, like we all know, like don't you know? I thought we all knew that. It's like it's just so behind the scenes obvious. And then here's it's ridiculous how we pretend like there's no influence here. All the corporate media screeches at you about how you're a conspiracy theorist, but here you can have documented information or a video of McCain and Graham in 2017, literally addressing the Azov movement. And at this time, they were on the record not supposed to be funded by them. They were on the record being called Nazis and dangerous. But here they are telling them, our fight is your fight is our fight.
Нашого народу і нашої держави. І я, як президент, і як верховний головнокомандувач, хочу подякувати кожного з вас.
I admire the fact that you will fight for your homeland. Я захоплююсь тим, що ви боретеся за свою батьківщину.
Your fight is our fight.
Ваша боротьба – це наша боротьба.
2017 will be the year of offense.
Рік 2017 рік буде ріком нападу.
All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
Ми всі повернемо.
Because they're not involved at all, though, right? I mean, it's just painfully stupid. But going forward, he writes, and two interesting side notes here. We have seen on the recent mass shootings the number 14. Now, this is an interesting point that I didn't even connect. We've talked about the 14 because we've read these documents live on the show before. But check this out. And this is something that people, it's another connection to these shooting conversations, because it's not just about the Azov movement, the Rise Above movement, and the overlap. We have obvious connections to some of these shootings that tie directly back to the Azov movement, and they just never really want to talk about that, like Buffalo, for example. But it says, we have seen the recent mass shootings, the number 14, written on the rifles used. We've had many guesses as to what they mean. After reading this, he's convinced this is what it is. Now, it's his opinion, but I think he's right. As you can see here, it says, notwithstanding Daley's admonishment, the Rise Above movement and its members documented their white supremacy extremist ideology in both private and public internet postings. In a video taken by the Rise Above movement associate, later posted online, the Rise Above movement associate asked Rundo to say, quote, the 14 words. Based on my training and experience, and this is from the FBI documents, I know that, quote, 14 words refer to a slogan commonly known and used by white supremacy extremists and neo-Nazis that states, quote, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. Rundo responded by saying, I'm a big supporter of the 14. I'll say that. Well, isn't that interesting? Now, this either means that these people are actually radicalized to the point where they're writing this on there, or there's a reason that the agenda is they're writing this so these connective points can be used when the time comes to lay the groundwork to make it look like what they want it to be. I truly believe this is about laying at the feet of Russia. There's already arguments being made online about how, I did an entire show about this. All the Nazi elements, turns out, come back to Russia. Oh, look, all of the leadership in Azov are actually Russian people. There are arguments. They're really trying to lay that out. It's so obvious that was the plan from the beginning. And so my point would be, this is being written on there, so then you can try to make that connection. Right? That this is, little clues they're going to connect back. The same point here, it simply says in this affidavit, while it seems the perpetrator of the Christchurch mosque massacre didn't travel to Ukraine as he claimed, he clearly took inspiration from the far-right movement there and wore a symbol used by the Azov movement. And to sum this up, it says the United States, I thought there was another picture actually. It was not, well, it's further down, I think. He says, the United States has for years funded, trained, and armed the Ukrainian regime, while inadvertently, through the support of groups like Azov Battalion, given direct support to the extremists both within the U.S. and abroad. It's not inadvertent, guys. You can prove they went out of their way, legislation, to get arms in their hands. First of all, as I showed you, it's not debatable. They did send these shells, and so did the U.S., by the way. I did a whole focus on that. Even Euronews is making a point to say, despite health concerns, so it's not debatable, as we've been telling you, and I'll show you in 10 seconds. Now it says how Russia has used depleted uranium. Of course, because they want to make it sound like they're trying to tell you there's no danger. That's a conspiracy theory. But let's also point out that Russia does it too. Okay, if you're telling us there's not a problem, then why would you try to be like, Russia does it too, like a 6-year-old? Well, because to pretend Russia does it too in some way justifies that you're using it. But why would you need to justify using something that's not a problem? I don't think they think these things through very much, but it says here, although their use in Russia's current campaigns remains unconfirmed. Cool. So you wrote an entire article about something you can't confirm. That's called propaganda. It says it again right here. There is currently no concrete evidence of Russia using depleted uranium in Ukraine, but it, quote, would be incongruous if they're not using it, says a Russia expert, which probably has never been to Russia and really knows anything about it. But, he's an expert because he is in the think tanks. I'm just making a joke, really. I don't even know who the person is. Depleted uranium rounds are a key part of their armory. Well, that's just not true. Now, yes, they have them in storage. Now, maybe they're using them that I can't see, but show me where they're being used. Show me where we can prove these have been used in Ukraine this entire time. If you can't show any evidence of that, it's very clear to me that they are not part of their, what the word they use. Well, it's just that there's not part of their armory, whatever they're arguing, that they have them in storage. Like a lot of these places have The U.S. has all sorts of chemical and biological weapons they're not supposed to talk about, or they're supposed to be destroying, or even nuclear weapons they were supposed to be removing, except they're all making more now. So who cares about the non-proliferation treaty? We just move forward. The point, though, is that you don't have any evidence of that. So their entire argument is Russia does it, and that's why it's, under just beneath the surface why it's okay that we do it, but you can't even prove that. That's just ridiculous. But here's from the Ukrainian side, turning the whole thing on its head and saying, you're all wrong. Didn't even happen. The head of the RMA denied the fake about the alleged explosion of ammunition during the Russian missile strike. So despite even Newsweek's ridiculous fact check pretty clearly finding that it was an ammunition depot, here's what the Ukrainians want you to think. And then ask yourself why anybody takes what they say at face value. Now, I'm not talking about Ukrainians at large. I'm talking about Ukrainians at large. I'm talking about the Azov movement, the government, the politicized discussion of this. Oh, wait a minute. Did this reload? Or was it this one? Dang it. I think I had this highlighted and lost it. That must have been the other one. Why isn't that working? In any case, let me look real quick. It says it was stated that according to him, some of the Russian missiles were shot down. He says, we don't know what the targets were determined by the Muscovites. Remember, that's a derogatory term, right? Everyone's freaking out about misgendering somebody. Here they are calling them derogatory content just publicly and then being reported by the corporate media. It's just these people are parodies of themselves. It's ridiculous. But it says, but where the rockets landed is a terrorist act. It's okay. First of all, if we're talking about depots and ammunition, well, it's ridiculous to frame everything Russia does as terrorism. And it's the same thing we just talked about. But it says a crime against humanity. Why? Well, because these are civilian objects. Well, if that was the case, well, yeah, that needs to be called out. Seemingly interesting, though, how they don't care about that happening all over Palestine, or Israel's government just directly targeting civilians all over the place, and then even publicly saying that we will bomb these areas if they do something, which is called collective punishment, where they knowingly bomb civilian areas in a general sense. If anything happens, then we can even ask whether that even happened, blah, blah, blah. The point is that's obviously happening in Israel, occupied Palestine, or we can point out the civilians being starved and bombed and attacked in Yemen, or it's the same thing that always happened in Venezuela, or the same thing that's happening in Afghanistan still, or the same thing that's happening in Syria. So it's still going on. We just talked about Syria. So even if it is happening, it's important to understand that it seems they only care about it when it's happening when their adversaries do it. But both of them matter. It's not whataboutism. They're both important. The point is we need to prove either side and realize that if they're saying civilian objects, well, we should prove that, right? We shouldn't just take at face value what they're saying, especially since they've been caught lying almost more than half the time I've seen. But he said in the first shelling, it damaged warehouses, agricultural goods, and humanitarian aid. Right. You tell me if this looks like humanitarian aid. Clearly. I mean, this is how stupid they think we are. So agricultural goods and humanitarian aid. Now, maybe they're trying to make you think, oh, maybe there's fertilizer. Oh, there's a big bar. But even then, that was the kind of game they played in, I think, Beirut and the places. We're being lied to, guys. This is not some random thing. This is, at the very least, an ammunition depot or something more. Then it says, in the mass media and the internet, information is being spread that a warehouse of ammunition with depleted uranium has been destroyed. This is a fake. Now, it's interesting that they talk about the depleted uranium and say it's a fake. But you could argue that means it's still an ammunition warehouse, but up here they're saying that's not the case. It is launched by those people who work for the Muscovites to stabilize the situation and cause panic. I officially declare no ammunition exploded during the missile attack. There is no depleted uranium. There is nothing to worry about. After the missile attack, the Russian Ministry of Defense informed the area that a long-range air and sea-based high-precision weapon was struck at the locations of the units of the armed forces of Ukraine and the storage of places of ammunition, weapons, and military equipment from the Western countries, or that came from Western countries, which insinuates that it's depleted uranium. Now, it says here on April 25th, it became known that Ukraine, together with Challenger 2 tanks, which used depleted uranium shells, received those shells, in particular depleted uranium from Great Britain. The British Ministry of Defense informed on May 11th that all the promised Challenger tanks had arrived in Ukraine. May 11th. Kind of interesting to see the time frame, right? And then 2 days later, they directly targeted. And now they just want you. It didn't happen. Well, seeing as how it's obvious, I think that it's ammunition, and they're lying about that, I think we've caught them in a lie. But you can look through the geoconfirmed information. You'll find, and this is even what Newsweek is pointing at, not that it makes it valid, but you can look at, they break down the different geolocations from different angles, a lot of different people doing the same thing. Here's the POV, And it gives you who geolocated it with the thread. You can check for yourself. And, it breaks this stuff down. It goes into the different locations. Now, just to cut to the chase, because it's basically just showing you the different locations broken down, geolocation, is that ultimately, and I have the other one up here too. I think I find it easier to look at when it's on Twitter. Than what they're showing you here. Where was it? This brings us to, it says a Soviet former ammunition depot. So essentially triangulated using different locations, and it's saying in 2011, 30,000 tons of ammunition were stored 3 kilometers from this town, the one where it just happened. So at the very least, it seems very clear to me that this is an ammunition depot. And why wouldn't it be used to store these 2 days ago in the same location? I mean, it kind of makes sense. Now you can see that this was the location that was bombed. Now what we can show is that this is in fact a location that is not what they're claiming. And then we'll go over to the Moon of Alabama point to show you what I mean. And then, here's right here. This was the thread just online, and you can look through for yourself all the different data and the triangulation. Now here is May 15th, Moon of Alabama. And it says in the early morning of last Saturday, they destroyed a large ammunition depot near that city we just discussed. The pictures show the depot before the strike and after. The depot sat at a rail line some 5,000 meters from the west from the city center. And it's likely the explosion destroyed not only a large amount of ammunition, but also a large number of windows and cities and caused some casualties. Right? So that makes sense that would be the case. Now it says, I think that was it. Yeah, it's saying the city is some 200 kilometers from the Polish border. The depot was likely held ammunition that was coming from the west to go to the front lines in East Ukraine, which makes sense about what this would be. All right. Now, the main point for me before we get into the actual risks of this stuff is to think about what the implications would be with this. Right. So first of all, it seems very obvious this was a targeted ammunition depot. And then why Ukraine would want to lie about that? I mean, maybe just to hide the fact that they exploded a bunch of their ammunition, which seems to be very important right now. Not just because ammunition is important, but because there's an obvious game being played about, they're going to run out. They're going to run out. The point is that if they lied about that, it seems more indicative of trying to hide something bigger. That'd be my opinion. And so what does this mean? So if the way this seems to make sense to me, and this is just my opinion, if I'm kind of trying to suss out motive here, which is completely opinion and guessing, would be that obviously they sent depleted uranium. And obviously Russia's aware of that because Russia actually said something and said, that's a problem. I said, those are dangerous. And not only just that you giving depleted uranium is dangerous, but the fact that you're giving these kind of people the high-level weaponry, this is going to lead to a serious event, was generally what he was getting at, but obviously did point at the nuclear aspect, or rather the radioactive aspect of what these are. I'll prove to you next. So, with that being said, that when you're knowing this breakdown, it makes sense to me that Russia would then go, oh yeah, the point I left out is that then the U.S. government, as I pointed out, steps up and goes, you're lying. As we just showed you in Newsweek, they quoted the U.S. government. They're not dangerous. We use them all the time. They're super normal. Okay, so Russia goes, okay then, I'm going to call your bluff. I'm going to target that depleted uranium. I'm going to blow it up, and I'm going to cause a very serious disaster in Ukraine that you're going to have to ignore, because if you point at it, you're going to have to admit that you lied about the danger of depleted uranium, and then that will retroactively admit that you've been using it in all these other countries. It's just a thought, but it kind of makes sense. But that also shows you, if that's true, that the Russian government would knowingly cause that disaster, despite the fact that it would cause a lot of harm to the civilians of the area. And I wouldn't say that. I would say that makes perfect sense, because governments do that. They will make a choice about what's best for their agenda, and the secondary point, if at all, would be about the people that they get hurt by it. But the point is that not tactically very smart? Of course it is. That's not to say good or bad. It's just tactically smart, because it puts them in a weak position. It removes a lot of ammunition. It stops them from being able to use that dangerous ammunition, and it puts the problem right in their backyard. And then the U.S. is going to be forced to ignore this. And somebody, if that is what it was, is going to point this out. They're going to go, what is going on in this area now? Look at all the problems. 10 years from now, we're going to look back and say, look at all the birth defects. And people go, there you go. It's interesting to think about. Now, that's just a theory. But going forward, let's talk about the actual risk here. So aside from the fact that was depleted uranium, understand that no matter where it's being used, this should be a really big deal. And it's not just the U.S. government, guys. Realize that a lot of their allies, too. The point is, this is being used. And it's unbelievable to me that they pretend like it's about density. This is a weapon, guys. Obviously, but this is I was talking about this earlier today, this morning. It's like, I want to call it something else, right? So if it's got you could almost call it a chemical weapon if we're talking about the toxicity of the metal and the chemical properties to it. But if it has the radioactive part, it still just is a kinetic weapon. But I feel like even a nuclear weapon it's more than a kinetic weapon, right? Because of the nuclear fallout. So it's hard to place it in chemical, nuclear, biological, however you want to look at it. But the interesting part is that it is still being used. And it's very clear to me that it's not even remotely about the density. There's other things that could be used. And they know and have known, and I'll prove it to you now, the long-term and immediate risks. And I think that's exactly why they use it. Really quickly, to go over a couple of quick points from this, read this whole entirely, because this will keep you up at night. Birth defects and the toxic legacy of the war in Iraq from 2020. Now it says here, we begin logging these cases in October 2009. Remember, the occupation starts in 2003. It says, and we have determined that 144 babies are born with a deformity for every 1,000 live births. God, that's disgusting. And then up here, actually, it says, while most of these children do not survive, some live for weeks, months, or years, often in pain with grave disabilities. 144 out of every 1,000, which they compare to Iran, and it's wildly over the top. It says here, when Iraqi scholars and doctors catalog incidences of birth defects and note that their rates exceed that of Hiroshima. Just to place that in your mind. We all know Hiroshima, right? We all talk about the horrific event and, except we all pretend it's about freedom or something. And really it was after the war was already ending and they decided to use it anyway. Easy to look up. But the point is that this is about the use of a nuclear weapon. And yet what's happening in Iraq, you are seeing a higher level of birth defects than what happened in Hiroshima. And we don't talk about that. Then it goes on to say, in Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, and Syria, these ecologies, like the tracking of how the environment has changed and the situation because of the war and what they've done, are not always accidental side effects of military operations, but are instead central components of military strategy. And that's what we're talking about. It says the Americans wanted this. These Iraqis are telling him, all the ones he spoke to. If they didn't, they would have cleaned up the war, cleaned up their wars. They starved us during the sanctions. Now they're poisoning us. That is a sad, repeated story around the world. Adhering to shock and awe, and this, if you haven't heard this, will blow your mind. Adhering to the shock and awe strategy, the United States launched 800 cruise missiles within the first 48 hours of the invasion in March 2003. More than double the number of missiles launched in the entirety of the Gulf War. That's the first 48 hours. Then it says between 2002 and 2005 alone, the U.S. Armed Forces expended 6 billion bullets. That's roughly 200 to 300,000 bullets for every single Iraqi killed. Think about that. This number of shells, full of lead and mercury, not even talking about depleted uranium, does not include larger ordnances or the metals remnants from after 2005 or from previous wars. The Iran-Iraq War, where chemical weapons were used, given to him by the United States. The first Gulf War, the sanctions era, 1991-2003. And the 2003 occupation, instigation of a further decade of militia warfare. The most recent military intervention in Iraq was accompanied by an unprecedented waste abandonment and waste burning. Discarded vehicles, excess weapons, discarded clothing, and much more were all left in Iraq's land, air, and water. It says studies based in Fallujah, which sustained extensive damage during the U.S. assaults between 2004 and 2008, show a high rate of congenital malformities, 15% of all births. 15%. International activists accused the U.S. Department of Defense of negligence for using a weapon in Iraq, depleted uranium shells, that distribute toxic waste where civilians live, grow food, and draw water. Oops. That is by design. Additionally, U.S. bases in Iraq used burn pits to incarcerate everything from computers to tires to large open-air pits they burned day and night for years straight. Which, by the way, we're now seeing directly affected the people that were burning it. U.S. military. Not that that should matter any more than any other human being, but the point is that these people were also being used by their government and are suffering long-term effects, and they're having to quibble and fight to get paid for it. They release high levels of dioxin, look at that, and innumerable other toxins that are known to cause health problems from birth defects to neurological issues. Some Iraqi babies born near Talil Air Base were found to have neurological problems, congenital heart disease, paralyzed or missing limbs, and elevated thorium in their bodies. And weirdly enough, the closer they were to the base, the higher the levels. Think about that in the context of the BSL-4 labs, Georgia, and the testing they're in the country, and it's everywhere, guys. Now, it says almost everyone he met in Iraq identified the high prevalence of birth defects as post-2003, directly related to the war. This kind of just makes me sick. Most of the women he talked to have healthy children from before 2003. And either miscarriages or children with severe birth defects afterward. He said it was common that they would line up their family and children by age so you could literally witness the line of pre and before and after the war. So children born up in 2003, fine. Children after, not. It's these obvious realities, and yet we quibble about this because team sport politics. Well, here are some studies about this. So Newsweek wants you to think that it's not dangerous. Or any of the government wants you to think you're ridiculous, you're a conspiracy theorist. Ukraine wants you to think you're lying about all of it. Well, here is a toxicity of depleted uranium in 2010. I promise you they know about all of this. It says, while depleted uranium is less radioactive than natural uranium. Now, we have depleted uranium, naturally occurring uranium, and then enriched uranium. Enriched being the highest, natural being in the middle, and then depleted being very low. But the point is not none, but less. So there's obvious radioactive components to this. And yet they just want you to dismiss it because it's not real, but it is. It says it still retains all the chemical toxicity associated with the original element. That's the metal side of it, the toxicity. In large doses, the kidney is the target organ for the acute chemical toxicity of this metal. So I'm not even talking about the radioactive part of it. We know this stuff is so incredibly dangerous, and they use it anyway, producing potentially lethal tubular necrosis. In contrast, chronic low-dose exposure, like what they're dealing with in Iraq, or in some cases, chronic high-dose exposure to depleted uranium may not produce clear and defined set of symptoms. Chronic low-dose or subacute exposure to depleted uranium alters the appearance of milestones in developing organisms. Adult animals that were exposed to depleted uranium during development display persistent alterations in behavior even after cessation of depleted uranium exposure. Exactly. So it lasts. They had exposed to it, they took it away, and they were never the same. Adult animals exposed to depleted uranium demonstrate altered behaviors and a variety of alterations to brain chemistry. Despite its reduced level of radioactivity, evidence continues to accumulate that depleted uranium, if ingested, may pose a radiological hazard. The current state of knowledge concerning DU is discussed. Yeah, so they're telling you, if ingested, well, okay, so if it's in the water that you're drinking, which is what's happening in Iraq, if it's in the ground, yes. So it's not only being ingested, but it's being breathed in, it's being aerosolized in the air because of the explosions or because of whatever else is going on in the ground, and then it gets on your skin, and all of these are factors. I think that was the only part in this one. Here is a document from the EU. Does depleted uranium pose a radiation hazard? It's pretty simple. All isotopes of uranium are radioactive. Both uranium and depleted uranium and their immediate decay products emit alpha and beta particles and a small amount of gamma radiation. Depletion of the U-235 during processing leaves depleted uranium appreciably less radioactive. That's when you're enriching uranium or other processes where you end up with depleted uranium. It leaves them noticeably less radioactive. That's a given, at least what we're being told, than naturally occurring isotopic mixtures. But it says it typically contains 30 to 40% of the concentration of the naturally found uranium. Not enriched, but natural. 30 to 40%. But then it says this means that the radioactivity of newly produced depleted uranium is only about 60% of the natural uranium. Either way we're talking about is not a small thing. You're seeing at least half in some with the average there of the actual radioactivity that remains. Now, depleted uranium munitions collected in Kosovo also contain trace amounts of other radioactive elements. So there's other things to consider, but we're going to stay focused on just the main point here. But they increase the overall radioactivity by less than 1%. Okay, so we're still talking about an increase in radioactivity. So if that's a one-stop thing and it's over, which even then we know doesn't just go away, that's one thing. But if we're talking about shock and awe, massive bombing campaigns using depleted uranium to basically carpet bomb this area and then continue to do it for a decade or years, that is a carrying over, continuing, accumulating problem, which is why we're seeing generational problems. Uranium only poses a radiation hazard if it's breathed in, eaten or drunk, or enters part of the body exposed by injury. Well, good thing there was no explosions. Oh, well, I guess they are. So everybody that was involved with being hurt at that point was clearly immediately exposed. But then we have all the other things in the water, in the food, in the area, in your life in Iraq. Here is a post from the Royal Society. This is specifically on radiation from depleted uranium. What they're telling you isn't happening. The radiation resulting from the decay of depleted uranium. So now we're talking about combination of it just being present, but also just that it's the fact that we have depleted uranium munitions that are in the ground or exploded or pieces, the remnants of it that decay over time, is predominantly alpha particles, but also beta particles and gamma rays. All those we just talked about, they're all radioactive. I mean, that's the thing it said very clearly, that all of them are radioactive. And it says alpha particles are relatively massive, travel only a short distance, and are more biologically damaging than beta particles or gamma rays. However, they cannot penetrate the dead external layers over most of the skin and thus pose a minimal direct external irradiation risk, except we're talking about all of these at the same time. The water, food, the entire area has been overwhelmingly drenched in this stuff. Alpha particles produced from radioactive material within tissues are hazardous, and cells traversed by an alpha particle may be killed or may sustain genetic damage that very rarely can lead to a sequence of events that ultimately results in cancer. This type of radiation is often referred to as high linear energy transfer radiation. So no matter how you spin this, it's still there. So you can't just dismiss the idea that you're literally willingly using things that you know will leave a lasting effect for people. That's not by accident. And even if it is by, well, we want the density so we can pierce these tanks, you're literally choosing that you care more about the actual military activity and the sale of those weapons than the people you pretend you're trying to fight for. Shocking. I know. You guys know this already. Beta particles are highly energetic electrons, and those emitted from DU travel much longer. Exposure to both these particles occur when the DU is handled, and exposure to gamma rays will occur at a considerable distance from DU. A considerable distance. Gamma rays being, I think, the worst one. Now it says, however, the biological damage caused by the passage of beta particles or gamma rays through cells is much less than caused by alpha particles. The radiation from both beta particles and gamma rays is referred to as low linear energy transfer. All right, so clear that these are potentially dangerous. Now here's the most important one. To get into the actual, this is just overview, saying dangerous, not dangerous, Kurtz. This is the statistical breakdown, or rather the metrics about depleted uranium and what they deem safe and not safe. Then let's compare that to what they tell you happens when you're around depleted uranium and see what you think about it. As always, it's this simple, guys, and it just blows me away that more people aren't doing this. Depleted uranium. And it gets into what it is and, blah, blah, blah. And here's where it gets to the point. There are a number of radiological protection regulations and guidelines. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission's regulations. It's weird to me that they differentiate between an occupational dose and an average person. So apparently if you work for the government, you're able to take in more radiation. I don't even know why that makes sense. Or because they probably know you're around it. They want to just arbitrarily be like, you're allowed more because you're going to be around it more. They basically say their regulations for occupational dose to individual adults state an annual limit. So an entire year of the total effective dose equivalent of 5 rem. Or 50 millisieverts, which is another metric we can use, but we're going to stick with REM because that's the one that seems to be used the most, which stands for Roentgen equivalent man, which I'm not even sure what that stands for. The point is that that's the metric they're using. 5 rem per year. Now remember that. We're going to come back to it. For members of the general public, which is what we're actually talking about more specifically, not military, but you, their regulations require that the total effective dose equivalent to an individual member of the general public not exceed 0.1. How is that even possible? So why exactly think about how much more that is. 0.1. I don't even know, what does that break down to? What is 0.1 to 5? That's a huge increase. But apparently these people work for the government, so they're able to take in more. I don't even know how that makes sense. But let's go with both of them, though. So I broke these down so you can see the breakdown here for the millirem, which is what we end up using in a lot of these discussions. So 5 rem is 5,000 millirem. And 0.1 rem is 100 millirems. Now, I'll show you why this is important. So what they're saying is you as the average person can't take in more than 1.1 rem a year, or otherwise they consider that too much or that's dangerous, according to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Now, it goes on to say depleted uranium, because of the different percentage of uranium isotopes in depleted uranium, its specific activity is approximately 40% lower than naturally occurring. Well, there's the point again. So we're just going to ignore the other 60% of uranium. So it is still potentially radioactive, but lower and much lower than enriched uranium. That's true. However, as discussed above, the chemical properties of depleted uranium are the same as those in the enriched and natural forms. It says the chemical and physical properties of depleted uranium are ideal for many military and commercial uses. It is 65% more dense than lead. Now that's the argument we all hear. Has a high melting point, is highly prophoric. It ignites when it in fragments, and that I think is the main point on top of the rest of it. Has a tensile strength compared to most steels, and is chemically highly reactive. So if you're going to pick out the things that make most sense to the things they do, I'm pretty sure they've got the technology they don't need heavy things to pierce tanks anymore, right? So at the end of the day, it ignites when it fragments. That's a very important weapon to use. Now, that's an interesting point, by the way. You know, the image of today's show? Take a look at it. What do you think? Just because we see that does not prove that all those little fragments are that. White phosphorus has a similar look to it, right? But that's interesting, isn't it? Overlap to that. It ignites when it fragments, just like that. But it says has a tensile strength and the chemically highly reactive. To me, it's about the danger to the average person or just whoever it's being used against, to kind of, the same way that Israel does it, and they just hurt people so they can say that's, you do this, people will get hurt. It's like, it's collective punishment, trying to scare people away from wanting any more action to happen. And also the fact that it's just a more effective weapon. But here's where it gets important. In July 1991, a large fire occurred in Camp Doa near Kuwait City. The site housed a number of combat-ready vehicles, and a series of blasts and fires damaged or destroyed vehicles and munitions, including M1A1 tanks and depleted uranium munitions. Troops at the scene and those involved in the cleanup efforts may have been exposed to DU residue. Other troops may have been exposed through contact or vehicles or inhalation of DU-containing dust. So clearly there's an issue here. So the idea of whether that exploded is probably why they don't want you to think that happened. In estimating the number of U.S. personnel exposed to depleted uranium and the extent of this exposure, the Department of Defense and their Office of the Special Assistant for the Gulf War Illness, which, again, we act like that's not exactly what we think it is, categorized potential depleted uranium exposure scenarios into 3 different levels. 3 levels. So it's level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 being the worst. Level 1 exposure. The highest level occurred in or near combat vehicles when they were struck by depleted uranium rounds, or when soldiers entered vehicles soon after the impact. Level 2, intermediate level, occurred when soldiers and civilian employees worked on depleted uranium contaminated vehicles, or were involved in cleanup efforts after the fact in the fire, inhalation of the dust, and so on. That's where I think we're talking about over all this. But it says level 3, the lowest level, occurred when troops were simply downwind from burning of that ammunition. Think about how dumb it is. So I keep telling you, some of this stuff was just burn pits of dangerous ammunition, which is hurting themselves. But it says they can, or the DU contained vehicles, or the fire, and so on. Then it says it has been estimated that the exposure of level 1, so the high level, of individuals, excluded those with embedded DU fragments, which of course we just don't, why? Of course the point is that they have fragments embedded in their body, they're far worse off. But it says who were inside a tank when a single uranium penetrating entered the crew compartment. Okay, so you get hit by one of these things that has depleted uranium. What it says is that would be 0.48 rem for a 15-minute period. So just using that as a kind of a metric. Now, obviously, lasting or in open areas, it changes it. But either way, just to use, it's only one of the only metrics we have other than 0.5 over the year, which is also relevant, 0.48 rem. Okay. So the way I broke this down, there are 96 15-minute periods in a day, just to give you something to see as a number. So that means in each 15-minute period, having 0.48 of rem, again, which is 480 millirem, that ends up being, so times 480, that ends up being 46,080 millirem. Okay? So what we're talking about here is the exposure for one full day, essentially, if you were stuck in this location with that explosion. Not dead, but just the aftermath of the depleted uranium being around. Okay, so keep that in mind in the first part we talked about. Oh, and this was just the last part I was going to show you on this before we go forward, was that this whole thing was about these risks and what it said there and the information. And at the end, they basically just say, the committee makes recommendations in Chapter 8 about depleted uranium. So why in the world do you kick this off onto some other point or page, and then what they actually say is this? While a group of veterans exists with depleted uranium in their tissues, the majority of veterans exposed to depleted uranium is unknown. The committee urges the continuation and expansion of efforts to model potential exposure. So nothing, they kick it down the road. Such efforts may result in quantitative assessment of Gulf War exposures. Isn't that what you were just doing? Further, the committee urges publication of results in peer-reviewed literature so we can have the broad review. No, all this, they just put this aside and move forward. This is from the year 2000. Final point. Radiation, how much is considered safe for humans? 1994. First part. The average exposure in the United States. Just a normal natural day, which who knows if that's because of their problems and, dioxin background kind of discussion in the case of radiation. But, let's forget the unknown risks that we shouldn't be there for the moment. What they're telling you is natural sources of radiation is 300 millirems per year is what you already get just by living. An adult, they say, should not exceed 5,000 millirems of radiation in general over a year's period, a grown adult. And actually what that is the federal employee. It's way lower for an average person, but the current federal employee limit for an entire year is 5,000 millirems. Well, what I just showed you was that just the full day of exposure in that tank we talked about, that alone adds up to 46,000 millirems. Quite a bit more. So I kind of find it hard to believe that carpet bombing, what was the number again? I mean, it's important to understand what we're talking about here. In the first 48 hours alone, 800 missiles. Okay, so they just annihilated this place. Depleted uranium used all over the country, as well as burn pits and everything else we talked about. So, I find it hard to believe that if you can gain 46,000 millirem by being close to one of these locations and, just in that 1 day period, that you bomb this entire location and this wouldn't have some more lasting effects. But this gets even crazier when you get into the average or the children, a minor. Okay, the maximum permissible exposure for a person under 18, which is the point. There is all sorts of children, both being after being born, but also that were just existing in Iraq when this was happening. Under 18, they say that they cannot exceed 500 millirems per year. 500 millirems per year. So think about the number we're talking about here. Right? And if we're talking about the overall being, what is it? So they said it was 5 rems a year. That was the allowable limit for the average person. It's so obvious to me that look, just take it back to this one, actually. Yeah, this one. There's a lot in here, by the way, that you should check out. There's so much in here about the side effects that I didn't even get into. And it's the individual members of the general public not exceed 0.1 rem per year. Now, again, I think I broke that down right here. Oh, there it is right there, by the way, the number of the rem to millirem, just so you can see it right there. Oh, right, where was it? Sorry. Yeah, right there, 0.1. That's 100 millirem. That's it. For an entire year. I think it's very clear that the amount we can see based on what they said can happen being within just a 15-minute period by being in that location after it's exploded, point Fort Rem for 15 minutes, that it's obvious that the lasting effects is gigantically past what we say is acceptable. And apparently it doesn't matter. But it gets even worse. A fetus. Because we know there were pregnant women that existed there. Well, it says the limit for the gestation period is 500 millirems. So it's very weird to me that it's the same amount for a minor. I find that impossible to believe. Either way, both children, minors, and just average people are being exposed way beyond the amount of the allowable limit.
Now, let's take a listen to this clip from James Corbett and James Even Pilato with New World next week.
Welcome back to New World Next Week. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com.
And I'm James Evan Pilato from MediaMonarchy.com. We asked Epstein for advice. We've got that story, plus non-binary transformers, but first on this epic, gnarly episode, outrage over World Health Organization guidance on sexuality for infants. The World Health Organization is under pressure to withdraw guidance for schools recommending that toddlers ask questions about sexuality, explore gender identities, and learn about enjoyment of early childhood masturbation. The guidance says that sexual education starts from birth and is described as a framework for policymakers, educational and health authorities, and specialists. Its advice on how to talk about sexual matters with young children was aimed at policymakers across Europe and was translated into several European languages and promoted at national and international events. This according to the baby sniffers themselves. And you can see some of the documentation in the links, of course, always included in your show notes. The document also cited in a report consulted by Welsh ministers who last year rolled out a mandatory sexual education syllabus to schools in Wales and has led to a backlash from the government, members of parliament, and activists. The advice proposes that 4 to 6-year-olds should be taught to talk about sexual matters and consolidate their gender identity. It recommends that children under the age of 4 should be told they have the right to ask questions about sexuality and the right to explore gender identities. The WHO guidance also says that children aged 4 and under should be taught about enjoyment and pleasure when touching one's own body, early childhood masturbation. These topics are described as the, quote, minimal standards that need to be covered by sexuality education. That's their minimum, but they would definitely really like more. A government spokesperson said the UK government does not recognize this WHO guidance and we don't agree with its recommendations. We have not distributed it or promoted it to schools. We offer our own guidance to help schools to teach children about, and young people, about relationships and health. However, the WHO guidance was first published in 2010, cited in a 2017 report commissioned by Welsh ministers entitled Informing the Future of the Sex and Relationships Curriculum in Wales. James, do the words Jocelyn Elders mean anything to you? Do you remember those?
I remember vaguely, but not in detail, no.
It's fairly American event. So we go to Wikipedia. Jocelyn Elders comments on abortion and masturbation. In January 94, in the context of abortion, U.S. Surgeon General Jocelyn Elders said, "We really need to get over this love affair with the fetus and start worrying about the children." Later that year, in December, she was invited to speak at a United Nations conference on AIDS. She was asked whether it would be appropriate to promote masturbation as a means of preventing young people from engaging in risky forms of sexual activity because of all that AIDS that Fauci had just made a few years earlier. And she replied, "As per your specific question in regard to masturbation, I think that it's something that's a part of human sexuality and it's part of something that perhaps should be taught. But we've not even taught our children the very basics, and I feel that we have tried ignorance for a very long time, and it's time we try education." Elders' comments on masturbation, to put it lightly, caused great controversy, and days later, with the quickness, Elders was forced to resign by her Arkansas buddy that gave her the job in the first place, President Clinton. James, this President Kevin Spacey timeline sucks.
Yeah, indeed it does, doesn't it? How life mirrors art sometimes. So this is one of those stories that isolated and taken out of its context, and just looking at this document and the particular quotes, you could say, oh, this is cherry-picked and you're misinterpreting and you're blowing it out of proportion. But it, of course, is not just this one document in this one place with this one thing. So let's expand the scope of this discussion a little bit, and we'll do so by way of an article, a pretty comprehensive article that was sent to me by way of Corbett Report member CQ, who pointed me to stopworldcontrol.com. They have this extensive post up about various documents that promote this agenda, including a UN document called International Technical Guidance on Sexuality, Education, and Evidence-Informed Approach that came out a few years ago under the auspices of the Global Education 2030 Agenda, an agenda that I'm sure you had no idea existed until 2 seconds ago, but if that sends shivers down your spine, then at least your spidey sense is working properly. So I think that needs to be interrogated just on its face. But in terms of the document itself, as Stop World Control points out, there's a lot of different pull quotes that are quite disgusting. This guidance aims to equip children to develop sexual relationships, etc., etc. Or we could turn to Ryan Cristian, Last American Vagabond, who had a post up recently on UN normalizes pedophilia, pointing to the International Council of Jurists, the ICJ, at any rate, with their 8th March Principles for a Human Rights-Based Approach to Criminal Law Prescribing Conduct Associated with Sex, Reproduction, Drug Use, HIV, Homelessness, and Poverty, which is quite a mouthful, but he points out some of the quotes from there that similarly are trying to insert language about normalization of sexual relationships with young adults and children and other such things. But you see, this is the type of thing. Again, if you take these various quotes and these documents out of context, and then of course, you're leaving room for the, well, actually, fact checkers to come along and fact check it away. So, for example, it aims to equip children to develop sexual relationships from that UN Agenda 2030 education document earlier. Well, that's not the quote exactly. It aims to equip children and young people with knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that will empower them to realize their health, well-being, and dignity, develop respectful social and sexual relationships, ... So it's not saying, no, it's saying that you're going to develop children to have values and understanding so that they can then become the type of adults who have good, meaningful, consensual sexual relationships. It's not talking about equipping children to develop sexual. You're reading too much into this, etc., etc. You can do that 8 ways from Sunday. The fact checkers over at AP News had UN report talking about the ICJ report that Ryan Cristian was talking about, did not call for decriminalizing sex between adults and minors. And they make the argument that, no, this is, if anything, this is a pro the consent, age of consent laws. It's a strong statement in favor of enforcing these laws against sex with minors. And then it goes on to say, the report does say that sexual activity involving people with a minimum age of consent may be consensual in fact, if not in law. And in this context, the enforcement of criminal law should reflect the rights and capacities of persons under 18 years of age to make decisions about engaging in consensual sexual conduct and their right to be heard in matters concerning them. So, yes, okay, well, actually, it's right, but you're still wrong because you didn't get the context right. So this is an important part to understand for people. There is no document that's going to come out and say, yes, children should be forced to have sex with UN officials or whatever. But of course, that is the subtext, that is the context, and that is why it will always be framed in ways that you know what health means. You know what education means. Why are you trying to read too much into these documents, you crazy conspiracy theorist? It's because we know exactly what agenda is at play here, and we know the long-term goal of all of this. And what really gets to me about this is the way that the actual content of what is being stated here is couched in layer after layer after layer of euphemism and framed in a way that, don't worry guys, you're crazy if you're making too much of this. So we have to recontextualize this and lay it out so that we can see it's not just one document from one agency with one pull quote, it's a number of them, and they're all trending in the same direction. I wonder if there's some sort of agenda going on here, like an Education 2030 agenda, which of course raises the even deeper question of the concept of a centralized curriculum for children. All children must learn these things. Well, what things? Who's deciding that? What is education, and who gets to put these ideas in the minds of young children? incredibly important things that at least people are starting to think about. Of course, they'll be called conspiracy theorists for thinking about it, but at any rate, the conversation is being raised, right, James?
Simple math can't be performed by children behind the cash register at stores. Tires can't be changed on cars, but they can make sure you know all about the strangest sort of things, again, that generally I would have always thought were for adults. James, I'm a real weirdo. I like horror movies and stuff like that, but I've never thought that they're for everyone. Now people at 8 o'clock at night are like, okay, kids, let's watch Dexter. It's, as I noted earlier, bonkers. And that's how we get going on this New World Next Week episode 519. There does appear to be some sort of through line agenda. Non-binary character in new Transformers cartoon goes viral as people call for another brand boycott. Psyops in disguise. Out of the indoctrination ovens from studios in Hollywood, as Zero Hedge writes, is a children's computer animated television show called Transformers Earthspark that first aired on Paramount Plus last November and has embraced, of course, the woke movement. They call it woke. I like to often joke because they don't know how to spell conscious. Paramount Plus might be digging its grave after the show for young kids appears to have recently promoted gender ideology, which was the style at the time. I know I'm safe when I'm with my friends or other non-binary people, a character named Sam said to Transformer Nightshade. Some of perhaps the most hilarious words ever spoken on New World Next Week. A character named Sam said to Transformer Nightshade. Sam also said her pronouns are she, they. The 1-minute clip tweeted by libs of TikTok has been viewed 8 million times in about a day. I'd love to see, how that compares to CNN ratings and stuff. The cringe woke cartoon, of course, isn't the first. Disney's been cranking out cartoons for a while, enraging parents who continue to support and buy this crap. The proliferation of woke cartoons should be a wake-up call for parents, and the need to vet kids' shows as Hollywood and the left wages a culture war on the youngest generation. Where are they getting these ideas? Paramount Plus might be walking the fine line, as some Americans have already been on a roll boycotting products from corporate America, such as woke Bud Light, James, whose non-American parent corporation, AB InBev, just had its stock downgraded due to this whole dumb thing. Anheuser-Busch stock downgraded by HSBC analysts over Bud Light crisis. Meanwhile, Elon says, hold my Bud Light, and replaces himself with a clot shot pushing masker from the World Economic Forum, NBC Universal, aka Comcast, and brought to you by the Ad Council. Linda Yaccarino, Twitter's new CEO, World Economic Forum chair, she's told Elon he needs to limit his tweets. According to Linda Yaccarino's LinkedIn page, as well as her own tweets, she is a vaccine-mandating, mask-wearing globalist who's about as bad as all that sounds. James, all these things, it's like they kind of go away and then get reintroduced. So did eugenics basically get reassignment surgery and come out of a different bathroom as the transhumanist agenda? Which, as we've said before, the transhumanist agenda is really about the post-human agenda. So many agendas, James.
Absolutely right. And there is a historical continuity. And I think the Big Oil documentary spelled that out. Early 20th century eugenics, late 20th century, the environmental global warming hype, and then 21st century is technocracy, transhumanism. So yes, I think there is a through line there. But as people note in the Twitterati universe, making funny comments about this, putting the trans in Transformers, right? But there's something deeper to that. That is not just some sort of tangential thing. I think there is something to that, which is why I had What is the Trans Agenda? Questions for Corbett number 82, where I specifically spelled this out. It is about breaking down the barriers of identity so that eventually you can be shepherded into the new, well, you're a digital identity and you can be anything you want in this digital cyberspace. Live your life in the VR goggles. It'll be better than life. What could go wrong? So there is something really, truly connecting these agendas. And it's, in a way, it's perfectly obvious as to why Transformers would be the obvious way of introducing this to grooming young children. Let's not say introducing, educating. No, grooming young children to accept this breakdown of the most fundamental concept of human social relations, which, again, I think the people who are, what galls me is that the people who would scream the loudest about, oh, you think this is some sort of slippery slope and blah, 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 are the exact same people who 20 years ago are saying, you think the gay marriage equality is going to lead to, drag queen story hour? You're crazy, slippery sloper. Well, actually, now that we see what happened, I wonder if there's something to this slippery slope argument. But if we can take something perhaps positive out of this, the idea of framing this rather than just outrage at, look at what these, culture creators are doing. Oh, damn them. Can't they just give me what I want? No, framing it in terms of the idea of, now the idea is being implanted in people's heads. Hey, we can boycott things. If we don't like what this corporation is doing, we don't have to buy their crap. So, hey, Bud Light, goodbye Bud Light. Miller Lite, I don't know if you saw that. There's a new controversy about that and some of their woke advertising that's coming back to the surface. And people are starting to say, well, maybe we don't need Miller Lite either. Maybe we don't need Transformers cartoons. Maybe we could turn to, independent media producers, and we can create our own media, and we can do things for ourselves, and we don't have to buy their crap. I think that's an important concept that we can take out of this, and that's why I talked about it back in 2013. You and Cassie and various others were on my Solutions, Boycotts, and Boycotts episode of the Corbett Report podcast, and I had a boycotts edition of Solutions Watch a couple of years ago, so I'll throw those links in the show notes for people who need to remind themselves of this. But I think that is something positive we can take out of this. Well, we still are in the driver's seat. We still get to choose what we are buying and whether we're going to actually support these agendas with our time, our attention, our money, our resources, and our lifeblood, or are we going to start taking and just making our own stuff, because they're not going to give it to you. They're not going to give you what you want.
Or like maybe the only independent punk band that didn't capitulate completely these last 7 years, like Fugazi sang many years ago, I'm paraphrasing, don't pay attention to what's selling, pay attention to what you're buying. Thanks to my buddy Girder of Conspiracy Cinema for the Night Owl Inc. t-shirt of the Transformers parody of of course, the best Transformers character, the one with the boot blocks and the cassette tapes. I'm also, look at me, shilling it all. I'm also rocking my GetWokeUp.com hat, and actually both of those folks are Media Monarchy members and supporters, but are also active participants in all this that we're trying to do, James. So, I guess if the first two stories were Bettergate stories, I guess I'll add on too. As the gnome just keeps running his mouth more, James. I find this really interesting. Epstein moved $270,000 for Noam Chomsky, paid $150,000 to Bard College's Botstein. Jeffrey Epstein paid $150,000 to Leon Botstein and transferred $270,000 between accounts for Noam Chomsky, the two academics have confirmed, giving another glimpse into how the late disgraced financier provided favors for those who associated with him. Botstein and Chomsky met multiple times with Epstein after he was a registered sex offender, the Wall Street Journal recently reported. Chomsky, a political activist and professor, told the Journal that they met occasionally to discuss political and academic topics, to be a fly on the wall in that room. Botstein, the longtime leader of Bard College in New York, said he met with Epstein in an attempt to raise money for the school, who I'm sure is just struggling to find change out of the couch cushions, right? They were among the many academics, politicians, and business people who met with Epstein in the years after he pled guilty in 2008 to soliciting and procuring a minor for prostitution. He was charged, in case you forget, in 2019 with sex trafficking and didn't kill himself in jail while awaiting trial later that year. The guards falsified the records and were let off scot-free. In response to questions from the Journal, Chomsky confirmed that he received a March 2018 transfer of roughly $270,000 from an Epstein-linked account. He said it was restricted to rearrangement of my funds and did not involve one penny from Epstein. Chomsky explained that he asked Epstein for help with a technical matter that he said involved the disbursement of common funds relating to his first marriage. My late wife died 15 years ago, probably of boredom. We paid no attention to financial issues, he said in an email that CC'd his current wife. We asked Epstein for advice. The simplest way seemed to be to transfer funds from one account in my name to another by way of his office. Chomsky said he didn't hire Epstein. It was a simple, quick transfer of funds. So I, of course, have to head on over to another former hero of the punk underground. You've heard me say his name 8,000 times. Jello Biafra's Twitter account to let him know the latest news, as he has been a longtime champion of Chomsky for decades. Honestly, James, that's how any of us in the punk rock 80s and 90s, that's how any of us know anything about Noam's overrated bloviating, was because he was hyped by all the fake left punks. And there's Jello, still tweeting about Swamp Thing, James, because I guess when your longtime heroes turn out to be Epstein pedos like Noam Chomsky, you tend to Trump. Sad Jello tweeting lame and gross Trump memes like it's 2016. Like at this point, they're just sad. This is what they're doing. Can't say anything good about your two-party illusion cult, so you let Orange Man live rent-free in your head for 7 freaking years, man. Again, I know I've said it, but it's something that's been kind of weighing on me these last several years. What a joke Jello and Professor Graffin from Religion Bad, Statism Good, and don't forget Al Jurgensen's Ministry of Greta and all the rest have all revealed themselves to be what they've maybe been all this time. So James, just what is MIT up to, the famed home of Noam Chomsky, so we can have something that isn't Pedogate news on this episode? MIT scientists create device that can hack dreams. It's like Inception, but much, much lamer. But is this any of this good? It sounds like just you could whisper something to somebody sleeping and essentially have the same effect. These are also the same people who say, we'll lower the planet's temperature if you do what we say. And I almost forgot to tell you, Elon Musk documents subpoenaed in Jeffrey Epstein lawsuit. And of course, he immediately headed on over to Twitter to take it on. This is idiotic on so many levels. That cretin never advised me on anything whatsoever. The notion that I would need or listen to financial advice from a dumb crook is absurd. As we of course know, Elon is perfectly capable of intentionally wrecking his scam businesses on his own. Thank you very much, James. This is something that makes me think of the work of Lauren Coleman, talking about the copycat effect. And I look around now and wonder, man, where did all the terrorism and moneypox go? It's all pedogate all the time anymore, so that seems to be the stories that continue to generate as again, it's all about the reaction, I guess.
Well, it's someone like Epstein is like someone like Gates, who around which you can see all of the spokes leading to all of the various parts of the agenda, and it is just interesting to see how that works. But I mean, come on, James, if you have to transfer money from one account to another, how else are you going to do it other than going through the offices of some convicted pedophile? How else could you possibly do that? It's crazy. It's absolutely insane. But I am expecting the Jello Biafras and other Chomsky lovers of the world to say exactly zero about this and to change their opinion on their beloved overlord exactly 0%. So anyway, I'm not holding my breath for any breakthrough on that front. But having said that, again, this story is the story that just keeps on giving. And oh yeah, by the way, Musk, right? Ooh. But he's a good guy. He said something bad about Soros, guys. And he said he's okay with, he wants free speech, even if it costs him money. So I guess the technocratic huckster will continue barking people into the carnival that is Twitter, and and then setting up WeChat, Twitter chat. We got to come up with some catchy phrase for that. But anyway, the agenda continues, and I think that is the kind of the connecting thread for this, isn't it? It's the agenda, and it's manifesting in every aspect of our lives in so many different ways. And ultimately, we know where this is going. We know what the end goal is. It is the technocratic, transhuman, neo-feudal future where you will own nothing and be happy. All of that is related to what is going on right now, and we're seeing different pieces of that puzzle. And yes, it could be very confusing, and you could dismiss any particular piece of this puzzle if you don't understand, oh, this is forming a picture, and look, here's the picture. So I think that's our task. I think that's what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, is showing the bigger picture and showing how these things connect. But keep that in mind when you're spreading this information to people who are not familiar with that bigger picture, is that they are going to resist it because it does not comport with their worldview.
James, I'm pretty sure George Soros is dead. I heard about it on Tucker Carlson's new Twitter show. There was a big rumor this week that George Soros had died of a heart attack. And of course, George Soros had to go to Twitter to say that the rumors of his demise have been greatly exaggerated. And Tucker Carlson is going to do his new show on Twitter. Again, he couldn't just set up his own website and stream it himself. You've got to use these. How else could you possibly get around these corporate behemoths that we created? The New World Next Week sigh. There it is. NewWorldNextWeek.com, however, has shirts and hats and DVDs and USBs and more. It gets you physical media that they can't shadow ban from Twitter and help support our fear-free and advertisement-free work of a more than combined 30 years. Myself, I stream news, music, memes, and more Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 Mountain Time at my little radio station I run from right here in New Mexico at MediaMonarchy.com/listen. James, that is New World Next Week, episode 519. Now, where do you think you're going?
I think I'm going to Bath. What? To take a bath? No, I'm going to Bath in the UK. As people know from my recent Solutions Watch episode, I am going to be actually in person attending the Better Way conference in Bath that is running from June, I think, 2nd to 4th, although there's a gala dinner to start on June 1st. Anyway, I will be there for that. If you are in Bath, I suggest you check it out, or if you will be in that neck of the woods. If you are not in Bath, you can get a virtual ticket to stream the event and watch it that way. Anyway, all the details will be in that Better Way Solutions Watch episode that I'll link up, and I'll have a reminder before I go. But anyway, I will be gone from next week until early to mid-June. So anyway, we will not be doing New World Next Week for a few weeks.
All right. I guess I'll maybe have to schedule up some things for myself. I don't do a ton of interviews anymore. Maybe this will be a good opportunity for me to set up, do some other interviews, do some other media. James, I appreciate you, buddy. That is New World Next Week, episode 519, my friend.
Right back at you. Looking forward to talking to you again next month. Take care.
All right, buddy. Take care.
Next, let's look at this clip from Grand Theft World with Rick Hargrove.
The U.S. National Security State and the Federal Bureau of Investigations are sending full entire SWAT units in order to get a Pentagon whistleblower that released documents proving that the U.S. government and corporate media have been lying to us about the larger proxy war that's happening right now between the United States and Russia. A war that actually involves American soldiers and American troops on the ground there that are very involved in this conflict that no one really knew about beforehand. This as the current president of the United States, who's talking about licking the world, just finally decided to address the Pentagon Papers, as of course his administration was telling you previously before that they didn't really exist, that they were fake, that they were manipulated, all according to unnamed security sources that the corporate media, of course, was regurgitating without even questioning, running their propaganda lies as if it was true, and with the government caught with lying about the war in Ukraine, lying about the documents that showed them lying about Ukraine. Why should we believe what the president of the United States is saying here? And the answer is you shouldn't. You shouldn't believe any government. As of course, Biden is telling everyone that he's not concerned with the information that has been released here, when a lot of the Americans paying attention and know what's going on here are concerned. The president of the United States said also that some of the top secret information is old in those documents, and that there is going to be a full-blown investigation as these documents were posted on a Discord group. All of this as the corporate media, including the New York Times, Washington Post, the Bellingcat Group, all worked together with federal agencies to go after a 21-year-old Massachusetts Air National Guardsman who allegedly is responsible for this leak and was apprehended over the weekend. Now, leaks do happen from the government all the time, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of those leaks are usually done by the national security state and promoted, openly talked about, and not punished if they serve a particular interest of the national security state. And if they dare highlight an issue that the national security state does not like, it's pretty clear that they will punish people to the fullest extent of the law and even beyond that. As of course, let's remember here, during the Donald Trump administration, there have been a huge amount of leakers that were celebrated in the corporate media. But now that there's a leaker exposing the Biden administration and its lies, the corporate media is literally working with the FBI to take them down. That right there shows you a clear conflict of interest, very clear unfair play by the media that, of course, is just the lapdog of the national security state.
This whistleblower situation is interesting because part of those leaks stated that the Ukraine is going to be out of anti-Russian defense missiles by like right now, spring, April, May.
Right.
They didn't want people to know that in February, so they kind of like sat on it, but now it's okay to know because they must have reestablished some supply line, right? The people who are behind this hunting down of a whistleblower in this case from the Washington Post, New York Times tag team. The people that are influential over those organizations are the second generation benefactors of the men who killed Kennedy. Now, a little bit of unknown history, because we're talking about the Washington Post, and they were part and parcel in the Kennedy assassination. So let's take a trip over here down memory lane, and let's look at something called Operation Mockingbird. So if we look at Operation Mockingbird, I would explain this to you, but first I should explain Project Mockingbird. Project Mockingbird, if I press this button, let's go up here for Project Mockingbird. This is the Wikipedia entry on it. I wouldn't trust this whole entry, but here's the gist. Project Mockingbird, a telephone intercept activity, was conducted between 12 March 1963 and 15 June 1963 and targeted two Washington-based newsmen who at the time had been publishing news articles based on frequently quoting classified materials of this agency, CIA, and others, including top secret and special intelligence. So here's the Washington Post actually doing the thing that they just hunted down that 21-year-old kid for, okay? Kennedy established Project Mockingbird because he knew there was something rotten in Denmark. And by the end of the year, he's dead. But wait, there's a lot more. If you look into these documents, now you can read this page and you can see how the Rockefeller Commission helped to like get to the bottom of all this. Woo! They're the people who benefited from his death. The rise to power, the people who killed Kennedy, they're second generation of evildoers, if you want to put it that way. They're presently in power and running. So if we go to Operation Mockingbird here, Operation Mockingbird is an alleged large-scale program in the United States Central Intelligence Agency that began in the early years of the Cold War. What year specifically? 1963. What year did they kill Kennedy? 1963. Who did Ron Paul just say this past week killed Kennedy? The United States government, and specifically the CIA. So I would limit it to, hey, let's add MI6 because the CIA doesn't do these things and get away with it without help. Project Mockingbird contains the family jewels, okay? In 1973, a document referred to as the Family Jewels was published by the CIA containing a reference to Project Mockingbird, which is their reaction because the CIA was running those people that Kennedy was running wiretaps on, which was the name of an operation in 1963 wiretapping two journalists believed to be disseminating classified information. The document does not contain references to Operation Mockingbird. That's why I wanted to disambiguate the two things, because project and operation are usually equated to the same thing in people's minds. Now, Operation Mockingbird used the Washington Post, and it was OPC's CIA founder, co-founder Frank Wisner, who was helping to run this, along with Cord Meyer. Now, if you look, what happened to Cord Meyer's wife, Mary Meyer? Oh, she was brutally murdered along a highway in DC because she had a diary about all these guys that were in the coterie that killed Kennedy. And so when you understand Operation Mockingbird or any of these types of angles, you're getting into one of the biggest unsolved, unaccounted assassinations in history, because they didn't stop. They gained power to use power. They reshaped the world in their image, and they're doing it right now during the Great Reset. These things are not disconnected. The war in Ukraine is a major part of changing the attitudes, values, behaviors, of beliefs of people right now and controlling interests. What do you think, Tony?
I mean, it's very well said by you. Certainly there's, I've stated this many times, but there's many different ways in which one can analyze the Ukraine war situation. as Jimmy pointed out, it's not a surprise as to what's been leaked. Like, we've been able to infer from the evidence. Obviously, there's, special operations most likely. It's very highly probable
they're over
going
there.
on there.
But now
we
it's
know
like
it's
from
a
an
failed
internal document.
It's a failed NATO state. Of course, saying failed, I think, based on NATO's strategy, is probably successful. They wanted to sort of destabilize and hyper-nationalize aspects of Ukraine, and especially with the eastern Donbass, made up of areas that have Russian-speaking peoples. In other words, they knew it's going to be an easy place, destabilized, and only helps. Unfortunately, it helps the end goal of the World Economic Forum the most. You get the push for the potential. So you get the military-industrial complex gets its alongside the Federal Reserve. So they start, they get all these contracts, government awarded contracts. The Federal Reserve is printing tons of money. So the industry is very happy. On the geopolitical front, you have destabilization only further impacting Europe, but not just in mass migration, but more specifically in energy. And then you have the situation where they're still pushing for the climate agenda with the World Economic Forum. So all roads point to the one organization that happens to be an international organization that benefits the most from whatever fallout happens from this scenario would indeed be the World Economic Forum. They can blame the war on increased carbon emissions or displacement of peoples or issues with food supply and logistics. And that's kind of actually what they want. They need further destabilization to manifest the Great Reset. And I think it was either John Down or Greg Reese did a video specifically talking about that specific issue, which is interesting now that I think about it just off the top of my head. As far as the whistleblower side of it, I just think of 3 Days of the Condor, which I wasn't aware of that movie, but it was when you made me aware of it back. So I
think the book I think it's by Richard Condon, and it's called 6 Days of the Condor. But to make it into the movie, they call it 3 Days of the Condor. It's about the assassination of Salvador Allende. That was Operation Condor, that the CIA ran on September 11th, 1973. They like the date. It works for them. September 11th. 1971 is when Khrushchev had a heart attack. But the CIA had a heart attack gun at that time, and you should never think that they did something like that. So it's not.
And that was released in the Church Committee, right?
Right.
In the 1970s. So when you look at it from that standpoint, is there a precedent for the CIA making sure they control various nation states? Well, that seems to be a precedent that's been.
I think that's
for
what their
70 years.
Their mission statement is, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much at this point.
And when you look into the origins, so essentially, if you follow it through, MI6 is a superior, older intelligence agency. It trains the Americans to create CIA. And then with Operation Mockingbird, they have total control of the journalists. And then you can take out a president and cover it up. But you need an intelligence agency that's supported by the State Department that has that Anglo-American connection.
Right.
And will carry out the agenda from afar.
That's right.
Right. Across the ocean, so there's a bigger picture to be studied and learned from all this, because that same group, so think about it. That same group is with us where we at in Ukraine, in Afghanistan, in Iran, in Iraq, all these places, Syria. Union Jack's right there with us.
Yep.
Union Jack's our best buddy, John Bull and Uncle Sam.
And that's my point. When it comes to precedents being set, we know what the CIA is about. We know what essentially American geopolitical strategy is. So looking back at it from that standpoint, when we look at whistleblowers, is it any surprise? So we've ever assumed, that the media ever had their best interests at any point in time.
What makes the Grand Theft World podcast unique, invigorating, exciting, and informative? Most other podcasts out there are either doing straight up interviews or they're just covering the daily news. They're covering current events from the day they happened. And that is effective. It's useful. It's a great starting point. And then sometimes these current events change during the week past the first story. So we like to give it a little time. You have to wait till some of the dust settles on these stories in order to give them accurate coverage. And the other thing that's really missing in the media landscape is covering the articles that are coming out every day. That's great. That's necessary. But who's bringing in contextual history so that you can understand what has been going on for decades and decades to lead up to the machinations and actions that we see unfolding today? So what we do here on the podcast is we cover current events. Many of these things are censored, but we wait about a week. As a forensic historian, I focused mainly through my career on the history of globalism and collectivism and things that they call maybe the New World Order. There's a lot of facts to these sort of circumstances, groups, events, activities, working groups that they've had over time. So for Grand Theft World listeners, we not only break down the current events, most of which that are censored during the week, we provide you with contextual history, we give you the source notes, the references, we do deep dives, and this really empowers you with an understanding of context and history so that you can make more informed decisions in your life. There's also a community, a membership where you guys can actually ask questions and we can get into the show and share evidence. And there's a town hall weekly for Grand Theft World for those who listen to it and are interested in covering the stories that we don't get to during a 6-hour show. Listening to it an hour a day, you could easily consume the week's news, but you're going to have substance and meaning and context and understanding. And with that, you can make higher quality decisions in your life. So if you're interested in more quality in your life, go to grandtheftworld.com, click podcast at the top, and we'll see you there.
Next is a clip from Unlimited Hangout with journalist Whitney Webb and her interview with STAVROULA PABST.
So another thing I wanted to bring up that you've already sort of touched on, but I might want to make it a little more explicit, is that, for example, in Western media, we're told all the time and have been over the course of this conflict, been told that, it's necessary to support the Ukrainian side, and this is why the US and UK and other governments have told the public to justify them sending millions upon millions of dollars to the conflict with little traceability and accountability. That this is necessary to ensure democracy in Europe, and Putin is literally Hitler, and all of this stuff, right? And essentially what you show in your piece is that this idea that what is really being done by the West in Ukraine is about protecting democracy is really hogwash, at least when you consider at least if you want to define democracy as like people having agency and direct involvement in deciding their leaders and their policies and all of this stuff. And an example you sort of touched on earlier, for example, is the role of big tech like Microsoft and Google, Silicon Valley companies, right? Having a major role in Ukraine's military operations, the management of the conflict, and also major functions of civilian components of the Ukrainian government. And of course, these companies are not Ukrainian. They're not based in Ukraine. They're not even based in Europe. They're based on the West Coast of the United States. And of course, they have a very extensive ties to the intelligence services of the United States, particularly Google, having a very well-documented relationship with the CIA and Microsoft's collaboration with intelligence. And, Israeli intelligence also in the mix there with Israel, all sorts of, non-Ukrainian actors really involved. And, as you noted earlier, the Ukrainian government under, these policy directives have essentially outsourced most of the functions of not just their military, but also their government to these foreign multinational companies. And people in Ukraine themselves don't have a lot of say over that. And of course, as we know now, or have known for several years, these Silicon Valley companies are increasingly interested in just the mass harvesting of data, and it seems unlikely that Ukrainian people have a lot of say over how their data is being used, and particularly in the Ukrainian government and military. Is there any transparency into how their data is being used? From what I've seen, I don't think so. It seems like Google and Microsoft have full control over that to an extent. So, in this type of public-private partnership, like you mentioned earlier, what exactly is going on here? What are the implications for actual democracy in Ukraine?
Sure. This is a situation. Of course, it's quite complicated, and a lot is happening. In short, as we've said, I really don't think any Ukrainians have any real sovereignty. And this is actually a situation. What's really been interesting, though I will say none of this is surprising, is that Zelensky, both he and the Minister for Digital Transformation, yes, Ukraine actually has a Ministry for Digital Transformation. The minister for that, who's Mikhailo Fedorov, they're actively going around. They actively show up at any high profile event they can, such as at Davos, such as at the Web Summit of last year, to be able to try to get investments and further quote unquote assistance for Ukraine so that they can, essentially try to fight this war. And of course, they're acting like they are able to win this war. I don't know how that would be possible, but it doesn't really change the fact that that's essentially what they're trying to do at every single chance that they're able to get, which means that, yes, I mean, a large number of corporations have lined up to help Ukraine, but by helping Ukraine, I would argue that they're essentially taking Ukrainian sovereignty, right? Whatever Ukrainian sovereignty exists still, these corporations are eating away with it with every agreement that is signed. And to be honest, it's to the point that if you were interested in looking up what's going on, you could probably just search for a major corporation and its efforts to assist Ukraine. You will probably find some weird stuff. It is that common. But essentially corporations are eating that, or they are taking on what should be government infrastructure in Ukraine. They are taking that over. I'm not really convinced that there's any real transparency on how these corporations are using the information they now have. I mean, based on what I was able to look for, they publish almost nothing. And I'm not surprised that they tell us very little about the transparency of what they're doing, because they realize that they don't have to. They understand, I think, very well that this is a wartime situation where it increasingly seems that anything goes. They know that the Ukrainian people are in a state where they can't functionally really ask questions and actually expect somebody to be held accountable. So in short, no, I find that there's very little transparency, and I think that there's very little chance for anybody to actually say what they'd like. And I should probably talk a little bit about the DIA app, which I discuss a little bit in my piece. Ukraine actually has a state in a smartphone app that encapsulates perfectly what's going on in Ukraine. And this DIA app is a state in a smartphone app, which I find to be quite creepy, to be honest, but okay. This app facilitates about 120 government services, including digital ID. You can register your business through DIA. You can pay taxes through DIA. DIA has even given like cash payments to people affected by the wartime. During COVID, DIA had also facilitated vaccination passports, as well as like cash payments to people who did get vaccinated. So in short, we're seeing a lot of these efforts kind of encapsulate itself perfectly in the DIA app. But I would say that very much DIA encapsulates a lot of what's going on wrong, because, you're essentially forcing this government app through. You're forcing a lot of tools. DIA is a very easy way to introduce new tools that people may have problems with, but you're able to do it quite quickly because you're doing it on a smartphone app, right? So if DIA now holds a digital ID, which it does, it's very difficult to resist that, because essentially the Ukrainian government can say, this service is now on DIA. Oh, this service is now also on DIA. We can use DIA however we would like to. And there have been a number of surveillance concerns regarding DIA. I think also there are just general privacy concerns in terms of people's secure information or very private information is on the DIA app. And I think that early last year, DIA and a number of other Ukrainian government services had been hacked, and a lot of people's information had actually been compromised, if I can remember correctly. So it's a situation where a lot of the public is being asked to use DIA to do a lot of everyday things. The population is especially asked to use DIA since COVID, because COVID was a time where you weren't supposed to access services in person. So the population is kind of being slowly coerced into using this this very invasive smartphone app where they really have little say over about how it could be used by the government. And again, just the idea that you would use a state in a smartphone app where, you know, who knows about Dia's ability to surveil the population. And I know this came up in my piece also, but funny enough, U.S. aid has supported Dia's development. And right now they're actually hoping, or it's been announced, Samantha Power had announced at the World Economic Forum earlier this year that she would like to see Dia and Dia equivalents make their way around the world, especially the global south, which, I mean, I think that's disgusting, but not really a surprise. And so it's been announced that they will be able to try to bring something like Dia to other countries, whether people like it or not. So in my opinion, Dia kind of encapsulates what's happening. A lot of initiatives are being rammed through quickly. They're being done in this semi-coercive way where maybe your life is harder if you don't go along, or if you don't use Dia, for example. You know, it's harder to get by in your day-to-day life if you don't have that digital driver's license, you don't have that digital ID. So I think a lot of that kind of encapsulates the overall problem.
So, in my experience in Chile, and I assume it's probably similar in Ukraine, essentially what happens when you have a lot of these government services move online, you stop being able to conduct them in person as you did before. And this is often very inconvenient for regular people. So, for example, applying for residency and things like that in Chile. Used to be in a government office, and because, you know, allegedly because of the migration crisis, it's all online now, and a lot more messy. And a lot of times they claim despite you uploading stuff to their servers, they claim to lose your documents and all this stuff. But essentially what's important here is that it's as they move everything to the digital realm, they tend to remove the equivalent to the physical realm to force you into the digital realm. And it's no surprise that you have a group like USAID, which has been named by numerous groups of, you know, across the spectrum, really, as a cutout for the CIA, that you would have them backing this type of initiative program, because essentially it's generating more data, and it also makes it much easier to surveil, like you mentioned earlier, what people are doing, and house a lot of people's sensitive data where they can easily access it. Because, of course, if it's all on all these different servers of different government offices, and you know, more decentralized, and, you know, tied up with physical locations and not in a one-stop shop digital program like Dia, for example, it obviously benefits them a lot more to have it all in one place. And something that I've noted as part of the Great Reset in some past interviews and in some of my past work is that at the same time, you have sort of like two parallel operations going on. So, you know, what we see here and what we've just talked about is this effort to push everything into the digital world, right? And so Dia, you know, government in a smartphone, you know, you have to go into the digital realm to access these necessary services in order to, you know, interact with the economy or do basic stuff like, you know, drive a car, for example. But this parallel push we're having is to exert increased control over the digital world, the internet, centralize the internet, and make it more easily surveillable under the guise of doing things like preventing hacking, stopping cybercrime, censorship to stop foreign malign influence and hate speech and all of this stuff, right? I see these as intentionally an intermingling sort of parallel operations. So you're pushing people into the digital sphere, essentially forcing them there through coercive measures, like you just noted, but you're also consolidating control over the digital world in an unprecedented way, right? So that sort of makes it take on this more, I guess, nefarious element in a sense. And that's why I think stuff like Dia is really, really disturbing, as you point out, in the fact that there's really no public say about it. And, you know, people in Ukraine, it's a war-torn country. You know, people are not necessarily in a strong enough position to make their voices heard in this government, particularly with, you know, the opposition and the media being under the control of Zelensky, who's very much aligned himself with the Western oligarchs responsible for these policies. It's a very sad situation. But something complementary in terms of what we've just been talking about with Dia is your discussion of Ukraine and central bank digital currencies. So can you touch on those policies and how they relate to things like the digital ID and the Dia app and things of that nature?
Sure. So I will touch on Ukraine CBDC. And quickly, I do really think that I think it's a little bit hard to say for sure what will happen, but I think Ukraine is fairly hell-bent on ensuring it becomes one of the world's most digitized countries. And I actually start the piece off with Mikhailo Fedorov tweeting about this video where it's about Ukraine 2030, where they're actively telling you they want Ukraine to become a cashless society. They want everybody to be using e-health and e-education type services. And now it's become kind of, in Fedorov's view, it's become essentially this paradise because everyone now has a very convenient life. So they're even using the word cashless there, by the way. So I think that while I don't know for sure, I wouldn't be surprised if they did start trying to remove or making these paper versions of services, traditional services, and the digital and the paper currency, I'm sorry, available to people. You know, that they're telling you where they want this to go. They actively talk a lot about where they'd like this to go. And my understanding is that Ukraine is actively trying to portray itself as this very digital, very front forward, whatever that means, country that will do anything to be able to prove to the world that it's moved ahead despite this war. And of course, they're acting like Ukraine will win, but that's kind of besides the point. In relation to the CBDC, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. Ukraine does have a CBDC in the works. It's called the e-hryvnia, and assuming that all goes well with it, this will be launched next year in 2024. Granted, when they say that, I don't know if the war will affect this, but for now, that's what they're positing they will do. Now, the e-hryvnia, there's a couple interesting things I did find about it, because it would be facilitated by a central bank of Ukraine, but it also would run on the Stellar blockchain, or the Stellar blockchain network, I should say. And I think that actually, I think Stellar is actually worth further investigation, because if you want my honest opinion, it's a little suspect, to say the very least. Stellar blockchain is technically a public network, but it's facilitated by the Stellar Development Foundation, which is a nonprofit. And if you look at Stellar, I feel that it very much uses the language of the elite, and it's very much in line, or the Stellar Development Foundation, I'm sorry, it's very much in line with the goals of the elite. If you look at their language that they use publicly, Stellar is aiming to become a global payment standard. And Stellar actually has been slated, or it's been selected to become a prospective European stablecoin. It's also collaborating with Mercado Bitcoin to help develop a future Brazilian CBDC. And if you look at Stellar's public materials, they actively have decided, it's actively fashioning itself to become the blockchain that CBDCs could be used on. So I think that people listening to this, I think a lot of people are aware of the general dangers of CBDCs. I also would like to say that Stellar in particular creeps me out, and it is being used here. In terms of the e-hryvnia, it's obviously part of this larger push towards CBDCs that's happening worldwide. And I do think that the current situation, we can talk a little bit about the general concerns regarding CBDCs, but in this case, because we already have Dia, let's say that the e-hryvnia is being launched. We already have Dia, which does already have a digital ID. And another thing about Dia is that a lot of people verify their identity through DIA to do other things. For example, people will verify their identity through DIA to access their banking services, to access the post office. It's even being used for like a chat bot where you can verify that you're Ukrainian, then you can enter the chat bot on Telegram to essentially report on enemy activities. So we're already seeing this CBDC launch within the context of a country that's, first of all, very hell-bent on becoming as digitized as possible, as quickly as possible, I should say. And it already has a digital ID. So it seems quite plausible that if there is an e-hryvnia launched, it could quite plausibly, I should say, be connected to the digital ID because that infrastructure already exists.
Last but not least is this interview with Johnny Vedmore and Corey Hughes on the John F. Kennedy assassination.
No, post 45, when he was brought to South America, and the reach that they had, because like the Galen organization was massive. I mean, it ended up in the millions during the Cold War. And if you ask me, the logistics specialist who put together how the actual assassination would go down was probably Reinhard Galen himself.
That's quite. That's. I mean, it's amazing. There was this change in that period. You talk about the importance of the 6 months after the end of World War II, and then the few years afterwards as well. How massively important it is, and people really underestimate what was going on during that period and the attempts to capitalize, because they knew that they were going straight into another war, and they knew that the borders would be set with Russia, and that war was a Cold War, of course, and lots of posturing, but in actual fact it has been a war. It's just been proxy wars all over the place, lots of a kind of economic war, then a policy war, and it's continued to shift and change until now it's almost come back to the same place. And the things I'm hearing now, the rhetoric that I hear, that I've studied in the 1950s, and there's a point in the post-World War II era where they just basically took over the universities, and they started really implanting lots of people. So you mentioned that there's links with the GMF. What other sort of university activity do you know about during this period, sort of like just after the World War?
Well, and as far as just after the World War, I don't have too much information. I can tell you this much. I'm going to talk a little bit about Jack Valente because it connects to all this stuff. So Jack Valente was the shooter on the knoll. There were actually 2 shooters on the grassy knoll. David Ferry was the first who fired the throat shot. The second shooter was Jack Valente, who I've already said.
David Ferry's an odd-looking fella. I mean,
yeah.
He portrayed quite well in the movie, but I mean, when you when you look at him, it's just, wow, that's an odd-looking fella.
So Jack Valente, this will connect to exactly what we're talking about in Harvard and all that stuff. So Jack Valente is born in 1921, September 5th, 1921. And he, by the age of 15, okay, by 1936, he's working as a hall boy for Humble Oil, who is owned by Prescott Bush, George Bush. Jack Valente worked with George de Mohrenschildt. And if you know about Kennedy, one of Oswald's handlers in Dallas, oil man George de Mohrenschildt, he was working for Humble Oil and knew Jack Valente when Jack Valente was a teenager. Okay, so that's Jack Valente's background. He ends up going to the University of Texas in Houston, where midway through, he's still working for Humble Oil. He's with them for like 17 years, and he ends up going off to the war. Okay, this is where things get interesting because his war record is a crock of bullshit. Allegedly, Jack Valente goes off to the war where he's a Air Force pilot, and he does like 50 bombing missions. But I've torn apart his war record, and none of the companies that he's supposed to have belonged to list him as having belonged to it. So he was not a fucking bombing mission. He lied about all that stuff. He was obviously a trained assassin at that time, and I have some information that would imply he actually worked with the OSS, who were doing some backdoor dealings with the Nazis at the time.
This sounds a lot like someone who matches this MO in that sort of era and that sort of period, running in the same circles. Tom Corbett. That sounds a bit like who was, have you ever heard of Tom Corbett?
No.
Oh, you will love learning about Tom Corbett. He's a special one indeed, but very much like that, an assassin. Stories about Tom Corbett he was the guy who stood next to a line of German soldiers, and someone would say, now one of you are going to tell us everything we didn't need to know, and they'd say no, wouldn't say anything, and then Tom Corbett would be the one to execute them, just shoot them in the head, and then that would urge the others on to do it. He was really the guy who did the really dirty stuff. There's also masses of evidence that he supplied a lot of women to JFK. And he's a massively important part of, linking up the British side with the American side. So he spent a lot of time in London as well. So Tom Corbett is one of the most under the radar people. He eventually went on to work for Kroll Associates, if you know.
I know all about them.
Yeah. Who does? I mean, anybody who does research like us always ends up at Kroll's door, and you go, ugh, that's really a horrible place. Like, that's where all of the horrible secrets are. Right, where were we? Sorry, that was really...
All right, so Jack Valenti gets back from the war, and he finishes up his degree at the University of Texas in Houston, and he applies to Harvard Business School. And so he gets rejected because he was a BC student. He is not a great student. And actually, I caught some inconsistencies in his alleged behaviors before he even went to the fucking war. Allegedly, he was working with their football team and he had to miss some school because he was doing some promotion for the school football team. But then in his FBI file, when they went and interviewed that coach, they're like, "Who are you talking about? I never had any help with these football teams." And so he lied about doing stuff with the football team before he even went to the war, right? So he was obviously being groomed and probably passed around from the time he was 15 working at fucking Humble Oil, right? So, anyway, he gets rejected from Harvard Business School. So what does he do? He flies up there. He spends the weekend with the dean. And then he comes home, and then he is all of a sudden, not only is he accepted, he's put into their accelerated honors program. Okay. And so he gets his master's degree at Harvard in 18 months. He's done by 48. And who else was at fucking Harvard in 48?
Well, Kissinger's there.
Henry Kissinger.
Kissinger. Yeah. There's a few of the really, and the people who were around, the people who were taking these people and deciding where they go were people like George McBundy, who, of course, is massively associated with, he was serving under JFK. I can't remember which position.
And he was also busted having a sexual relationship with Valenti.
Oh, really? Not a surprise. George McBundy. He's got a name. Like, who has a name? No, sorry.
All of those guys were fucking
George
each other.
Bundy. I say it wrong every time because my brain can't register it. Muck George Bundy. Who has a name like Muck George? Who has a name like Muck George? I mean, it's suspicious. But Muck George Bundy is the guy who said to Kissinger, no, don't go to the FBI. Come to the CFR. And a lot of these guys that seem to end up going through that route, like there's a lot of training, but a lot of it was Harvard. Through that period, the concentration, I mean, the CIA projects were echoed as they happened, as the creation of the CIA happened, and as you had the first coups at the same time. Kissinger's running his Kissinger's International Seminar to train young leaders to put eventually into the roles of these coups. Of course, it doesn't work as fast as they want. It's a much longer term project, training young leaders. It turned out, and after 17 years they get found out, but they had a lot of time doing it, and they were starting to do that. But it's also I take it you've come across what's his name, William Yandell Elliott as well, who's one of the big people. He was Kissinger's mentor. If you're looking for someone who was probably involved, he was an advisor to 6 presidents, I think, including Kennedy, and he's basically the hidden voice of hand of like this New World Order group.
Thanks for tuning into another episode of the Independent Review. See you all next week.
We have strong indigenous grandmothers and aunties willing to lead this camp. They're inviting you to come and stand with us.